Hi folks! Welcome to our short lecture for today, Collecting and Evaluating Sources. This lecture is geared towards helping students brush up on their source collection and evaluation skills for writing their college papers. Let's go! When writing research papers, you'll also be evaluating sources as you search for information. You'll need to make decisions about what to search for, so what will your topic be? You'll also need to consider where to look for those sources. Will that be at the library? Will that be through Google Scholar? And you also need to consider the validity of those sources. How valid are they in general consensus? Have they been peer-reviewed? Are they written for an academic journal? These are some of the things that you will need to consider and that we will talk more about in this lecture. The world is full of information to be found. However, not all of the information is valid, useful, or accurate. Evaluating sources that you are considering using in your writing is an important step in any research activity. Especially when you're in college, you are going to be held to a high standard to show that the sources that you're using to back up your claims, the evidence that you're using, is credible. Quantity of information, but there's also an uneven level of quality of information. It's estimated, in fact, that anyone attempting to research everything that's known about depression would have to read well over 100,000 studies on the subject. That's a pretty large topic. As you can imagine, we won't be reading anywhere near 100,000 studies to write our research papers, but it's an interesting scale to consider when we're talking about the vast amount of information that's available for us. Whoops, too far. Now, evaluating sources has been called an art, but it is also work. Much of this work is detective work. Students must decide where to look, what clues to search for, and what sources to accept. One tip: the temptation is to accept whatever you find, but try to resist that. Learning how to evaluate effectively is a skill you need both for course papers and for your life. When evaluating sources, you want to consider a few different things. Consider who's the author. What are their credentials? Do they work at a reputable institution of higher learning or a company? What's the title of the work? What's the summary? Where is this particular work located? Is this just a website, perhaps with a .com ending? Is this a library database? Is it found on YouTube? Is it found, all of these different things you need to consider. And then, of course, you also need to consider the timeliness of the entry. So that means if it's been published recently. For some fields, recent is much narrower of a window. So we're talking in the last year or two. For other fields, a 10-year-old paper is not going to be out of date. So that's something to consider depending on the field you're in and depending on what type of a paper you're writing. You'll also want to look at the keywords in that source to see what other categories the work might fall into. You'll need to evaluate the information to see if it's relevant and valid for your research. Something else to consider is the article peer-reviewed? For the research paper proposal and for our final argumentative essay, you are required to use peer-reviewed sources. And again, I have a video on that in Readings and Resources or in the Week 2 lessons. If you cannot limit your initial search, like if you're using a database, to peer-reviewed journals, you will need to check to see if the source of an article is in fact from a peer-reviewed journal. One of the ways to determine if a journal is peer-reviewed is to examine the information about the publication itself. You can check and see if a journal is peer-reviewed by searching the database Ulrichs Web. That's ULRICHS web, WEB.com, I believe. I have covered it up with my video. Yep, ulrichsweb.com is the full address there. So check that website against the articles, and it should tell you whether or not it's in a peer-reviewed article journal. Sources, you want to start to get reading. After you've asked yourself these questions about the sources and determined that it's worth your time to find and read that source, you can evaluate the material in the source as you read through it. Now, when you have that peer-reviewed article in hand, you'll want to check for a works cited page or any other sort of list of citations that might be included. These could be called references page or perhaps bibliography, depending on what style format they're using. These bibliographies or works cited can lead you to related material that might also be a good source to consider for your research. A little tip is sometimes I look at the bibliographies of relevant Wikipedia pages to find sources that would be helpful to me speaking about and supporting finding evidence for my argument. Now, one question I have is, why do you think Wikipedia is not a legitimate source to use for college-level research? Well, since we're not in a forum where you can answer, I'm going to go ahead and provide that answer for you. Essentially, Wikipedia is open access, and anybody can go in and change the entries for any particular topic. Therefore, you can't rely on that information directly from the Wikipedia page to be accurate or to be credible for like a university course. However, this is where the Wikipedia works cited lists come in. You can actually scroll to the bottom of the page of the relevant topic, and you'll see a list, and you usually will have each of the sources that they've referenced in Wikipedia already on there. And you can, a lot of times these will be hyperlinked, so you can click on those and look at those sources themselves. And that is often a good way to use legitimate information that you've found on Wikipedia for your essays, while not actually using Wikipedia itself for those essays. So that's just a little workaround, little hint on how to find some good topics and good sources, especially if you're struggling finding sources. All right. You'll also want to try to determine if the content of that source is fact, opinion, or propaganda. So this will take some evaluation on your part. Do you think the source is offering facts? Are the sources for those facts clearly indicated? If they're not clearly indicated, that's usually a good sign that perhaps the publication is not sharing everything with you, or perhaps they are motivated by their own agenda. So consider that. And again, if you think the sources is offering facts, make sure the sources for those facts are indicated very clearly. Is enough evidence offered? Is the coverage comprehensive? So again, you're considering whether the piece that you have seems thorough enough. Have the scientists or the academians provided enough evidence to support the argument that they're putting forward? And is their coverage comprehensive? Have they given any time to opposing views? If they have not given any time to opposing views, that's something you might want to consider. Is this a paper written in good faith? Is this a source that is biased perhaps in some way? Or is this source perhaps just lacking in professionalism or whatever it happens to be? So we're gonna be thinking about all of these things as you go through the process. So as you learn more and more about the topic that you are working with, you'll notice that this process gets easier as you become more of an expert. So don't get too overwhelmed. It'll come with practice. Some further questions you want to ask. These will raise some red flags. Is the article using objective or emotional language? If the article is using emotional language, there's a high likelihood that it's not written, it's not a scholarly article. Peer-reviewed papers, papers that are written for scholarship and for academia are generally, they try to be on the less emotional side of things and stay more objective. Also ask yourself, is the article full of broad generalizations that overstate or oversimplify the matter? If it is, this is something that would be a red flag. Your source might not be appropriate for a scholarly paper. Is the article opinion? If so, does the author provide sound reasons for their argument? If the author provides opinions with no reasoning behind it or no credible resources supporting their facts as evidence, then it's possible that that source would not be appropriate for a scholarly essay. And now we're talking again about how timely is the source. So I mentioned this a bit before, but is the source 20 years out of date? Some information becomes dated with new research that becomes available. However, some older sources of information can also be quite sound 50 or 100 years later. There are certain fields that might have had a seminal piece written 30 or 40 years ago that is still used widely today, but there are fields that is definitely not the case for. So you'll have to consider what topic it is you are researching and what you are writing about, and gauge whether or not your field is one of those that requires you to use a much more timely source. Recent sources are usually where students should focus their attention. I would say to avoid any scholarship that's more than 20 years old as a general rule. But again, like I said, there can be some wiggle room in there. Sometimes things are older and they're still relevant, so just be aware of that. So how credible is the author? If the document is anonymous, what do you know about the organization that's publishing this document? Are the arguments very one-sided with no acknowledgement of other viewpoints? Like I mentioned before, if that's the case, that particular source might not be very credible. Now I want to talk a little bit about the publication process because for print sources and for online sources, those are very different things. Print sources, I mentioned a bit about the peer review process, but the traditional print sources will go through an extensive publication process that includes editing, so working with an editor, making sure you've got proper grammar, proper terminology for whatever field it is you're working in, making sure your formatting looks good and everything is flowing in the manner that it should. It will also go through article review, which is the peer review process, like I mentioned, that it would go to other professionals in the field that would evaluate the methods and evaluate the research done to see if indeed the experiment is reproducible and a variety of other rubrics that they want them to hit. This process has fact checkers, multiple reviewers, and editors to ensure the quality of publication. Now, anyone in internet sources, they're very different. Anyone with a computer and access to the internet can publish a website or an electronic document, and they don't necessarily have editors, fact checkers, or other types of peer review or reliable rubrics that they get put through. So you have to take internet sources with a little bit of skepticism sometimes until you put that evaluation to work. With the advent of the World Wide Web, we're seeing a massive influx of digital text and sources. Every year, there are exponentially more articles, way more information available. And it's wonderful, but it does create some work. You have to wade through everything that's out there to find the real gems that are really going to help you in your argument creation process. One tip I have is that understanding the difference between what you can find on the web and what you can find in more traditional print sources is part of the source evaluation process. It's very easy for students nowadays to go online and to find full text PDFs, journals, all sorts of opinion pieces, and that's wonderful, and I love the access. But consider also maybe using your library, using the UAF library. The Iliad office can order any text for you from anywhere if you give them a little bit of time. They're actually really wonderful. So if you're finding a text maybe in the database, Rasmussen Library database, that they do not have, you can put in a request, and they will usually send you a digital copy straight to your email. So internet sources are great. More traditional, like hardback print sources, are also great, and consider using a mixture of both for your work here in college. All right, let's move on. Some sources, such as journals and newspaper articles, can be found in print and digital format. However, much of what is found on the internet does not have a print equivalent, and the internet has low or no quality standards for publication. Now, this can be true or more or less true for a variety of websites across the internet, and some do have publication standards, but it's difficult to tell right off the bat what those are, and it will take a little bit of research and just spending time with your topic so that you can pick out what those are. And understanding all of the points that we've covered up till now will help you evaluate your sources and find appropriate support for the arguments that you craft in this class, but also in other classes and perhaps in your life beyond after college. Because I'll say peer-reviewed or scholarly sources, I'll often interchange those. So I wanted to give you a definition for scholarly sources. So scholarly or peer-reviewed journal articles are written by scholars or professionals who are experts in their fields. That'll be the sciences or the social sciences, or the language arts or linguistics or math fields, all the STEM fields, really any set of professionals, experts, will have some sort of professional publications that are relevant to that focus, that subset, that field. And often the results of experiments are published in these journals. So it's kind of a great opportunity as an undergrad, if you kind of have an idea of what you're interested in for your career, or perhaps what you might be interested in in learning more about in grad school, or maybe you haven't decided your major yet. It's a really excellent opportunity to use the library's databases to look at some of those professional journals. Frequently, when you get out of college, they will charge subscriptions to these journals, and they can be quite pricey. So take some time and browse through the library's journals, and maybe pick one or two out that seem like they're relevant to your field or to your interests, and check out a couple volumes. Just browse. Now, as I'm out of school, I'm not in grad school anymore, I have to pay for my own publications unless they're provided through UAF, which I am grateful for. But anyway, just a little tangent there. So I wanted to show you some differences between the print sources and the internet sources as far as a few different categories go, and then we'll wrap this up. So authorship and affiliations. For print sources, it's usually clearly indicated, often on the frontage page, as soon as you open the book, who the author is, what organizations he or she is affiliated with, so maybe a university or perhaps a print house or perhaps a company or whatever they're affiliated with, that will usually be on there, and when the work was published and by whom, who the publication house was. Internet sources, the authorship and affiliations are frequently difficult to determine. Some sites may have an author or sponsorship listed, but many will not. So that's something to consider. You also want to think about bias and special interests. So print sources. Bias absolutely exists in traditional publications, but printing is more expensive and difficult to accomplish. So most major publishers who are out to make profit, which they all are, will either not cater to special interest groups or will clearly indicate when they are. And that's because they want to be able to sell what they're publishing to as many people as they can. They don't want to limit their market. Internet sources, on the other hand, the purpose of the online text might be misleading. A website that appears to be factual may actually be persuasive and or not as factual as they make it out to be, deceptive. You also want to think about the author qualifications. Now, in print sources, qualifications of an author are almost always necessary. They have to have some sort of reason that they're going to be published. Maybe they've published in a previous, like in the case of a novelist, they might have had a breakout novel, and then because of that, they'll have another opportunity perhaps to be published. Or maybe they're a doctor, a PhD in their field, and they have some authority, some expertise, so they might be more likely to have their manuscripts accepted for publication than an undergrad student, for example. So they usually have some sort of qualification, and that is part of the reasons why they're being published. Internet sources. Even if the author and purpose of a website can be determined, the qualifications of the author aren't always given. You might not know if that person has done any formal study on the topic. You might not know if that person is working for some umbrella corporation. You might not know any sort of background. And if you are given background, you have to consider, is this actual background, is this factual, or is this what they want me to see? Is this a narrative that they're pushing? And then we're talking about publication information. So for the print sources, now we're talking information such as date of publication, who is the publisher, who the author is, and often who the editor or editors are, is always clearly listed. Again, usually on the frontis page, right when you open the book. For the internet sources, again, dates of publication and timelines of information can be questionable. Dates listed on websites could be the date posted, the date updated, or maybe even not listed at all. So now that you have some ideas of the contrasts of a print source versus an internet source, I hope that you'll be able to collect and evaluate your sources going forward for our papers. So happy collecting. I hope you will use these guidelines and tips to help you discover meaningful and relevant scholarship to support the argument you will be making in your research paper. For more on conducting research, visit Purdue OWL's webpage at https://owl.english.purdue.edu/owl. And that should give you lots of extra information. Thank you for listening today, and if you have any questions, please shoot me an email. All right, bye.